What looked like another typhoon season was hiding something far more dangerous. Super Typhoon Uwan did not just bring winds of 185 kilometers per hour to the Philippines. It exposed a deadly pattern that scientists have been tracking in silence. This is the 21st typhoon to strike in 2025, the second massive storm in just 7 days. And now, meteorologists are realizing that the Philippines is not just facing bad weather anymore. It is facing a new kind of disaster, one that builds on itself. On November 9th, satellite data revealed something that sent chills through disaster response centers across Manila. Super Typhoon Uwan was not just another storm. It was triggering cascading failures across systems still broken from the previous week. Typhoon Kalmegi had killed over 200 people just days earlier. Emergency shelters were already full. Rescue teams were already stretched thin. And now, meteorologists watched as Uwan's 1,400-kilometer wide circulation approached the exact same regions. At 9:10 p.m., Uwan made landfall in Dinalungan, Aurora. The storm brought sustained winds of 185 kilometers per hour, with gusts reaching 230 kilometers per hour. But the wind speed was not what terrified disaster coordinators. It was the timing. Pagasa forecasters had seen powerful typhoons before, but this was different. Storm surge warnings reached 3 meters along the eastern coasts, not from wind, but from the ocean itself, rising like a slow-motion tsunami. Nearly 1 million people evacuated in 48 hours. In Pasig City alone, 272 residents fled their homes. Across the Bicol region, entire provinces emptied as families loaded into evacuation vehicles with belongings still damp from the previous storm. The evacuation centers built for one disaster were now housing refugees from 2. Children who had just returned to school found themselves sleeping on gymnasium floors again. Families who had just started repairing their homes were watching weather forecasts with the trauma of déjà vu. The hidden danger was not Uwan alone. It was what happens when disasters refuse to wait their turn. Emergency responders found themselves managing active rescues while still distributing relief supplies from the previous typhoon. The World Food Program was delivering cash assistance to 31,000 households, over 157,000 people, even as new evacuees filled the same relief centers. But that is only part of the story. The Philippines sits in what meteorologists call the perfect storm. Warm Pacific waters fuel typhoons. The archipelago's 7,000 islands create channels that intensify storm surges. And the mountain ranges that should weaken storms instead create deadly funnels for wind and water. But climate data from the past decade reveals something more disturbing. The storms are arriving faster, stronger, and closer together. Uwan reached super typhoon status with sustained winds of 185 kilometers per hour. Its circulation covered nearly the entire country, stretching 1,400 kilometers from edge to edge. Satellite imagery showed the storm's eye wall, a perfect circle of destruction, approaching coastlines where families were still repairing damage from the previous week. But beneath the swirling clouds, satellite data revealed the real threat: storm surge. Unlike tsunami waves that crash and recede, storm surge builds slowly, pushing seawater kilometers inland and holding it there for hours. The eastern coastlines of Catanduanes and Samar faced walls of water that could reach 3 stories high. Storm surge behaves differently than regular flooding. Instead of water finding the lowest points and flowing away, storm surge creates temporary inland seas. The water does not just rise, it spreads, turning fields into lakes and roads into rivers. Each island acts like a speed bump, slowing the typhoon but concentrating its energy into storm surge. The same geography that makes the Philippines beautiful, thousands of islands, dramatic coastlines, coral reefs, makes it uniquely vulnerable to cascading water disasters. When storm surge hits shallow coastal waters, it builds height. When it encounters narrow channels between islands, it accelerates. When it reaches coastal plains where millions of people live, it spreads like spilled oil. Meteorologists tracking Uwan discovered that the storm was moving west-northwest at 25 kilometers per hour, slow enough to build massive storm surge, fast enough to outrun evacuation efforts in remote areas. The storm's size meant that even areas hundreds of kilometers from the eye wall experienced gale-force winds. Places like Palawan, Visayas, and Mindanao, officially outside the storm's direct path, still faced dangerous conditions. Yet what comes next could be even worse. In 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan taught the Philippines a lesson written in seawater and silence. The storm surge reached 6 meters in some areas, higher than most buildings. Survivors described walls of black water moving faster than cars, carrying houses, trees, and everything else in its path. Over 6,000 people died, many of them trapped by water, not wind. Tacloban City became the face of that disaster. Residents who survived the initial impact found themselves surrounded by water that refused to drain. The storm surge had pushed so far inland that entire neighborhoods became temporary lakes. Families climbed onto roofs, then watched those roofs disappear beneath the rising water. What looked like flooding was actually the ocean temporarily relocating itself. Maria Santos, a Haiyan survivor. She described the sound, not like rain or waves, but like a freight train carrying the sea. The water came from everywhere at once, she remembered. It was not flooding up from the ground, it was falling from the sky and rising from the earth at the same time. Her house, 3 kilometers from the coast, filled with seawater in minutes. The water carried salt, debris, and the unmistakable smell of the deep ocean. Emergency responders learned that typhoons do not just bring wind damage. They bring storm surge and geographic reorganization, temporarily redrawing coastlines and turning inland areas into seabeds. Rescue teams found victims kilometers from any coastline, surrounded by seawater that had no business being there. The storm surge from Haiyan created temporary islands, temporary rivers, and temporary lakes that lasted for weeks after the storm passed. More recently, typhoons Goni and Vamco in 2020 killed 98 people and displaced 155,000. The patterns were the same: back-to-back storms, overwhelmed evacuation centers, and communities that never fully recovered before the next disaster struck. Each storm exposed the same hidden vulnerability. The Philippines' disaster response system was designed for individual emergencies, not cascading catastrophes. The people evacuating from Uwan's path remember Haiyan. They know that surviving the wind is just the beginning. They understand that the most dangerous moment often comes after the storm passes, when storm surge finds places water has never been before. And now, scientists fear history may be repeating itself. As Uwan made landfall in Aurora Province at 9:10 p.m. on November 9th, disaster response centers faced a reality they had never planned for: managing 2 major disasters simultaneously. Over 900,000 people were already in evacuation centers when the storm hit. The armed forces deployed additional troops from the Army, Navy, and Air Force to northern Luzon, but many units were still responding to damage from Typhoon Kalmegi. The Philippine Red Cross activated emergency teams with relief goods. Rescue vehicles were strained as resources were split between active rescue operations and ongoing relief distribution. President Marcos declared a state of emergency as the storm surge began building along the eastern coasts. The Philippine Coast Guard activated 547 personnel with 18 floating assets and specialized vehicles, but communications networks were failing as the storm intensified. Coastal monitoring stations in Catanduanes reported water levels rising faster than evacuation plans anticipated. The storm surge wasn't behaving like normal flooding. It was pushing inland in sheets, covering entire coastal plains in seawater. Bridge closures isolated entire communities. The Pinakanawan Overflow Bridge in Cagayan closed as floodwaters rose, cutting off evacuation routes for thousands of residents. Power outages left millions without communication just as the most dangerous phase began. Over 300 flights were canceled, stranding travelers and delaying relief supplies. Metro Manila activated its highest disaster alert, code red, as storm surge predictions reached the capital's notoriously flood-prone areas, like Sucat and Parañaque. The Department of Health declared code blue nationwide, activating emergency medical protocols. But hospitals were already treating casualties from the previous typhoon. Medical facilities in the Bicol region reported flooding on lower levels, forcing staff to move critical patients to higher floors while the storm continued overhead. Emergency rooms that had just cleared trauma cases from Typhoon Kalmegi were preparing for a new wave of storm surge injuries. But the most troubling data came from the meteorological stations tracking Uwan's behavior in real time. The storm maintained its intensity longer than computer models predicted. Its slow movement meant storm surge would build for hours, not minutes. Pagasa forecasters watched satellite loops showing the storm's eye wall remaining perfectly organized, even after landfall, a sign that Uwan would continue generating dangerous storm surge well into the night. Weather models showed more typhoons already forming in the warm Pacific waters. The same atmospheric conditions that created Uwan were still in place. The same ocean temperatures that fueled back-to-back storms had not cooled. Meteorologists studying satellite data realized they were not just tracking one disaster, they were watching a pattern that could continue for weeks. Because what happens next could rewrite maps. Super Typhoon Uwan has passed, but the hidden danger it exposed remains unresolved. The Philippines faces an average of 20 typhoons per year, but 2025 has already seen 21 named storms. Climate scientists describe a new pattern emerging in the Pacific, storms forming faster, intensifying quicker, and arriving in clusters that overwhelm traditional disaster response systems. 2 people died during Uwan's passage, but casualty counts remain preliminary as communication networks slowly restore. Rescue teams continue searching flooded areas where storm surge pushed seawater kilometers inland. The real assessment will not come for days, as remote islands regain contact with the mainland and floodwaters finally recede. But early damage reports suggest that back-to-back typhoons create exponential destruction, not just additive damage. The archipelago's geography cannot be changed. Its position in the Pacific typhoon belt is permanent. The 7,000 islands that make the Philippines beautiful also make it uniquely vulnerable to cascading storm surge events. But what is changing is the intensity and frequency of the storms themselves. Meteorologists tracking Uwan found evidence that warmer ocean temperatures are creating longer-lasting storm surges and more powerful wind systems that maintain strength over land longer than historical patterns predicted. Ocean temperature data from the past decade shows a troubling trend. The waters that fuel Pacific typhoons are remaining warmer later into the year, extending typhoon season and allowing storms to intensify faster than traditional forecasting models anticipate. Each typhoon season becomes less predictable and more dangerous as climate patterns shift faster than human adaptation can follow. Emergency management officials studying the Kalmegi-Uwan sequence are asking uncomfortable questions about the future of disaster response in a world where megastorms arrive in rapid succession. Evacuation. Centers designed for temporary shelter become permanent housing. Relief supplies meant for one disaster must stretch across multiple emergencies. Communities that never fully recover between storms face a new kind of vulnerability: perpetual disaster readiness. As rescue teams continue their work and meteorologists monitor the Pacific for the next storm system, the question isn't whether another super typhoon will strike the Philippines. It's whether the country can develop new ways to survive them when they arrive in rapid succession, creating cascading failures across systems designed for individual disasters. The hidden danger isn't just the next storm, it's the possibility that there might not be time to recover between them. Storm surge warnings remain in effect across multiple provinces. The meteorological patterns that created Uwan continue churning in the Pacific. The 22nd typhoon of 2025 may already be forming.